Mr President, one thing a State of the State address should do is build trust in government. Tasmanians should be able to hear commitments made by their state government and trust that those commitments are being made in good faith and will be delivered. Sadly, as the years pass with this state Liberal government, Tasmanians have fewer and fewer reasons to believe what is promised and committed to. This is a government that makes promises it doesn't keep. And the Tasmanian people are rightly becoming frustrated and jaded by this failure of integrity and authenticity. Mr President, examples of this can be as straightforward as the commitment made during the 2024 election just last year to introduce a 5% levy on short stay accommodation to be hypothecated, I believe, into funding for social and affordable housing initiatives, which has, as far as I'm aware, not been progressed. Seems like perhaps influential voices behind closed doors have been making themselves heard on that one. But not to worry, Mr President. I'm sure it was helpful to shore up a few votes as an election promise, so job done there, no need to actually deliver. Mr President, I will briefly mention two significant examples of this failure of honesty and integrity from the Rockcliffe government, one that's very close to my heart and that of thousands of Tasmanians, and one of particular importance to my electorate. Mr President, we cannot speak of broken promises and preferential treatment of special interests in this state without mentioning the Rockcliffe government's shameful abandonment, mid-implementation, of a mandatory pokies card. Gold standard consumer protection and harm minimisation ditched at the behest of their donors and friends in the poker machine industry. In relation to this dishonourable government backflip, I noted comments made in an editorial in the Advocate newspaper on the 21st of November last year, which were particularly on point, I think. That editorial said this, and I quote, "Shifty and spineless can be added to incompetent as epithets for Tasmania's Liberal government, and the first two can equally be applied to the Labor opposition. The major parties have sold out to the pokies lobby while turning their back on those in need. It's a disgraceful outcome when so much was promised." End of quote. Mr President, I could not have said it better myself. After the evidence-based, expert-advised policy of a mandatory pokies card was announced by then Finance Minister Michael Ferguson in late 2022, implementation of that card was progressing steadily. The Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission were diligently working through the design and technological matters to be addressed in the introduction of the card. It is a matter of public record that the poker machine industry, when initially invited to provide private input into the early stages of the design process, completely ignored the communications and consultation paper of the Liquor and Gaming Commission, didn't bother to respond, Mr President, presumably because they knew that the best avenue to advance their vested interests on this matter and to kill the card was their well-trodden path of backroom threats and promises. The early election called in 2024 provided the perfect setting to deploy their significant influence on both major parties, certainly something they have done to great effect in previous elections, most reprehensibly in 2018. And lo and behold, Mr President, at that 2024 election, we saw the Liberals begin to walk back from their promise of a pokies card. The shameful retreat was confirmed in its entirety later in the year once the champion of the card, Mr Michael Ferguson, was removed from Cabinet. So many thousands of Tasmanians, a great many of them confirmed Liberal voters, who had been rightly proud and admiring of the announcement to introduce the nation-leading pokies card reform, were then only to be horrifically betrayed by the government dancing to the tune of this tainted industry. An industry that has not only benefited for decades from policy and regulatory capture of successive Labor and Liberal governments, but most recently, after the 2021 Gaming Act amendments brought in a new individual venue licensing model, an industry that has seen venue retained profits rise astronomically. On average, I believe it's in the vicinity of a 59% increase in retained profit from poker machines in those venues. Michael Ferguson confirmed in a piece in the Mercury newspaper on the 1st of November last year that he was aware of a venue in the time that he was still the relevant minister that had seen an increase in retained revenue from poker machines of $73,000 in a single month, an increase of that amount in a single month. And yet, Mr President, this industry gifted a massive increase in pokies revenue, of which around 50%, we should remind ourselves, 50% comes from Tasmanian suffering and addiction, then executed a hit job on the nation-leading consumer protection and harm reduction measures. It's telling, I think, to note what else Michael Ferguson wrote in that talking point piece in the Mercury on the 1st of November last year. And I quote this: "With so much extra profit being made right now, thanks to Liberal reforms, there is room for genuine harm reduction if we care for the public interest. We should be alert to the sectional interests trying to undermine Tasmania's nation-leading approach, informed by facts, progressing with plenty of consultation, unanimously supported in Parliament. The public interest demands it of us all." End of quote. Public interest, Mr President, may demand it, but tragically, when it comes to poker machines, it's quite the opposite of public interest that is being put first by the Rockcliffe government, and shame on them for it. And shame on the opposition, who are even more of an industry lapdog, bleating industry propaganda, even more full-throated forcefully, and failing to put the interests of the Tasmanian community first. Mr President, the other significant example I wanted to touch on when it comes to the failure in honesty and integrity from the Rockcliffe government is a very local one from the electorate of Nelson. The matter of the sale or disposal of land at the Sandy Bay campus, originally gifted to the university. Mr President, I appreciate this is a topic relating to an upcoming bill in this place, so I'll be mindful of not going into too much detail or preempting the specifics of that debate. But it is certainly a current live example of a promise made by this government and then broken within a matter of months. During the state election of March 2024, in a barefaced preemptive effort to stem the anticipated bleeding of Liberal votes in the Sandy Bay area, the Liberals promised to amend the University of Tasmania Act 1992 to require any sale or disposal of UTAS gifted land to be approved by Parliament. Later then, in 2024, the state Liberal government tabled its University of Tasmania Protection of Land Bill 2024 to give effect to that promise. So far so good, Mr President. The government was on track to deliver on the promise made during the election. However, the government subsequently moved amendments to their own bill during the Assembly debate in November last year. These amendments provided for UTAS-owned land above Churchill Avenue to be rezoned to inner residential to allow, and in preparation for, UTAS to sell or lease that land for development. This is rightly regarded by many in the community, particularly the Sandy Bay community, as an utter betrayal of the election promises made. Having trumpeted during the election time about being the saviours of the Sandy Bay campus, the Liberal government have turned around 6 months later and sought to pave the way for the campus to be carved up. Without any public consultation, with scant information or detail provided, and bundled hastily into the very bill that was supposed to deliver an appropriately robust parliamentary scrutiny mechanism for any such proposal. So much for the promise, Mr President. It was never anything but a sham, it would seem. But again, it no doubt served its purpose for the Liberal Party at the time of the election. Perhaps it kept just enough voters in the party tent to deliver that second clerk seat, instead of going to a competitive independent who genuinely was committed to preserving and protecting the gifted Sandy Bay campus site. Mr President, these examples are not just failures of honesty from the Rockcliffe government in delivering on promises made. They also reek of backroom influence of vested interests and raise serious questions of integrity and transparency. Tasmanians deserve so much better when it comes to political leadership. The deception and broken promises of the Rockcliffe government are simply a disgrace. Mr President, while not going into the details as a budget speech would, it would not be unusual for a State of the State address to detail overarching reforms to our fiscal management regime. It's a fair question, when new policies are announced to ask how and when will they be paid for. However, a range of community stakeholders and MPs have rightly expressed frustration that this government keeps reverting to type when it comes to the tired reliance on short-term funding options dressed up as some form of comprehensive, mature financial reform. Inevitably, these short-term knee-jerk fundraising announcements pit sectors of the community against each other in a combative and divisive manner. Rather than gut the hard-working Tasmanian public service providing the community services and regulatory compliance that keeps us rowing in the same direction, or relying on the old failed cliche of robbing Peter to pay Paul, of selling off state assets for one-off and short-term cash boosts, an alternative State of the State address would change direction. It would acknowledge the imperative to make up for the last 11 years wasted by this government, which sought to avoid doing the necessary hard work on integrated, comprehensive and structural fiscal reform. A crucial first step would be the commitment to establishing the long overdue independent expert panel commissioned by Parliament to undertake a review of the current state taxation and revenue settings to ensure they are as robust as possible, with appropriate levers to drive necessary sustainability reforms while improving our fiscal fairness and efficiency. This proposal is one that I and others have raised regularly for many years now. Without undertaking such necessary structural reform of our financial system, successive governments are dooming Tasmania to continue going around in circles, from bouncing between the perennial debate regarding expenditure versus revenue. Mr. President, to touch on the predictable re-emergence of this privatisation agenda, I won't spend too long on this matter. It's been discussed in detail by others here and in the other place. However, I wish to emphasise that this current minority government does not have a so-called mandate for such stripping of public assets. Not only is it yet another example of lazy reversion to ideological agendas, it could prove counterproductive to the stated aim of contributing to a future-proofed Tasmania. And I do note, Mr. President, that not only does the government not have a mandate through an election for these sorts of endeavours, they are also likely to prioritise ones that don't even have to come through this place to get a mandate from a majority in both chambers. And that is disgraceful. I think we are going to be losing government entities without them even coming through here for consideration, because not all the ones that are likely on the list require changes to legislation to be dispensed with. I note the Premier's speech asserts the GBEs and state-owned companies, minus Hydro, Tasmania of course, are on the table as prospective sale items, apparently to instigate a public conversation about this. However, it is currently devoid of assessment criteria to inform either the community or the nominated GBE assessor, Mr Saul Eslake. Apparently, such sale assessment criteria may be forthcoming, hopefully by the end of this week, but the proof will be in the pudding once we see it, Mr President. And it is unclear as to how much all the government's budget repair eggs are in this one basket of asset sales. What is the plan B should the outcome of the GBE sales assessment not result in as positive a result as hoped for by the government? Mr President, similarly, we've heard much about the undefined right size of the public service as the other so-called plank of the pathway to surplus. What a nonsensical and half-baked statement that is. Right size for whom and to deliver what? Tasmanians can be excused for responding somewhat cynically to this terminology of right-sized without any additional context, particularly when there is no mention of any intention to implement the 77 recommendations and roadmap for reform provided by the independent review of the Tasmanian State Service released in 2021, undertaken by the independent reviewer, Dr Ian Watt AC. Imagine, Mr President, if the same question was asked regarding the right size of a taxpayer-funded chocolate fountain, or indeed for the right size stadium in the right location. Imagine if the current rate of non-transparent corporate welfare doled out by this government was placed under the same microscope as our public service and our publicly owned state companies and GBEs are proposed to be. How much money could we save there? Imagine if an alternative State of the State address detailed a plan which provided equivalent focus on the broad range of Tasmanian business sectors beyond solely that of construction. Perhaps a plan specifically focused on investing in and supporting sectors and industries which are female-dominated. There's a growing frustration with this government's myopic favouring of the blokey "we support you if you're wearing high-vis vest" approach. We have been told for consecutive years now that we have to keep building our way out of a crisis or into financial surpluses. And while that is no doubt an essential part of the puzzle, Mr President, it's by no means the whole kit and caboodle. And that message, Mr President, is wearing very thin. I warned during COVID that the over-reliance on building our way out of a pandemic, as promoted by PESRAC, was fundamentally flawed, and the fact that successive Liberal governments have become lazily addicted to that mantra is also indicative of the fact that PESRAC has failed in its strategy to put us back on a sustainable financial footing. The final PESRAC report was delivered on the 16th of March 2021, almost exactly a year ago. 4 years ago. Yet apparently we are still having to build our way out of the pandemic and build our way back to a surplus, but I'm not sure, Mr President, that the reality of that is going to come to fruition in the way the government hopes. It's also worth noting, before I move on, that a key element of business confidence is a guaranteed, transparent and level playing field. Confidence that support is not dependent on who you may know in government or whose ear you may be able to get hold of during election pork-barrelling period. A lack of clarity and transparency over why and how certain funding and assistance decisions are made for those in the private sector can be as detrimental for business confidence as red tape considerations, perhaps. If the government was genuine about carving out and building a robust and sustainable pathway to surplus, it would roll up its sleeves and get on with the hard work to deliver structural fiscal reform, and in a manner that seeks to address current structural imbalances such as gender, and establishing a firm level playing field which can underpin all working in the private sector. Mr President, people also look for leadership in a State of the State address. Unfortunately, when I listened for leadership in this year's effort from the Premier, I heard instead legitimisation of divisive language and rhetoric being used to pit people against each other. We've seen a propensity for this government to pick fights, such as the one they've recently picked with the whole tier of local government over planning. This government seeks to polarise, to divide and sow seeds of confusion and distrust. I'm concerned about a rigid, ill-fitting binary straitjacket this government appears to be trying to squeeze our Tasmanian community into. For example, there are now essential workers versus non-essential workers, a false binary, Mr President. Apparently, if you're not a builder, you're a blocker. Again, a false binary, Mr President, and a rude one at that. Not only is this trite, it reinforces an us versus them amongst and between Tasmanians. It demands people are either with the government or against it. It is unnecessary and destructive. It indicates a government which has abandoned any pretence of governing for all. There is an in-crowd with this government and those who are excluded. And if you are one of the excluded, you will be labelled with some juvenile heckling name by those who are supposed to represent and lead you. Mr President, this does not represent the Tasmanian community, which is certainly not binary in this way, but rather diverse in its views, values, priorities, and should be celebrated as such, not berated by their Premier and political leaders to score cheap political points on social media. Mr President, I firmly believe that the vast majority of Tasmanians want to see the government hit pause on this petty political attitude as a matter of urgency. Authentic political leadership should seek to bring people together, to emphasise common goals and values while respecting differences and the need to work collaboratively to draw people in and forward together. That said, Mr President, I urge the Premier and other government members to refocus on those principles of governing for all Tasmanians and demonstrating inclusive leadership for our state. Mr President, in summary, I think this State of the State address is actually an SOS. It is indicative of a government that has withdrawn into itself, abandoning the principles of all-encompassing leadership for a narrow, ideologically driven fortress where it is content to merely shout at its own, at the already converted. A State of the State address is an opportunity for the government of the day to deliver a plan detailing a pathway to a stronger and healthier community, a pathway to bring people together, and a pathway to investing in a broad range of sectors, initiatives, and importantly, ideas. Devoid of a legislative and constructive policy agenda, imagination, or ideas, this speech risks becoming a pathway not to surplus, but to a dead end, a pathway to nowhere, to stagnation, division, and missed opportunities. Mr. President, there is little interest demonstrated in the Premier's speech in the scope of or reality experienced on a day-to-day basis by the broader Tasmanian community. And that is a deeply worrying takeaway from the Premier's speech. This 2025 SOS delivered by the Premier exposes a serious need for a government reset, one that draws upon the strengths and opportunities of the current balance of power Parliament to generate constructive, considered, evidence-based public policy solutions for our state. A Parliament that may share the load in undertaking the necessary hard work of structural reform of the state's finances. Let's face it, neither of the two major parties are likely in the near future to achieve the numbers in Parliament or the political capital needed to successfully embark on a solo effort to deliver the significant financial structural reform needed in this state. What is needed is the courage to acknowledge this, the vision to propose a way forward to deliver long-term, enduring reforms, which can be undertaken in a collaborative way that shares the political risks and rewards. In noting this year's State of the State address, I sadly lament how far it falls short in providing the leadership and vision that Tasmanians need and deserve.